Thank you so much. So as Tammy mentioned, I'm Swaroop. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager for Customer Identity here at Okta. And later half of this section I will have Shay Logan from Rent-A-Center join us and tell us some of his stories from the trenches. So our legal team spent a lot of time thinking through the slide and putting a lot of interesting content. I don't want to bore you guys through the details, but there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I'm obligated to show you the slide. So for this session, we have an interesting plan, securing omni-channel experiences, right? So on the first section of this presentation, I'm going to give you guys some of the insights and stories that I have and some of the trends that I've seen from talking to customers across the board. And in the second half of this presentation, we're going to change gears, and Shay is going to take this down as a practitioner and give you guys all the details behind his experience implementing some of the pieces that that I've seen across the board. So, as you know, it's been about 12 years or 13 years since the iPhone was first introduced. And since that time, the number of devices that each of us own, the number of smart connected devices that each of us own has exponentially increased. I read a recent survey that said that an average user owns about 12 phones, 12 connected devices, and those number of devices are exponentially increasing year on year. But if you dig deeper, what's even more interesting is that it's not the number of devices, but it's also the amount of time spent on these devices. It's said that the average user spends 10 additional minutes on a non-desktop device. So if you are a business in this room, making sure that you can reach your customers across all of those channels that they spend their time on is kind of business critical. Today it's the smartphone and the tablet. In the future, we expect to see connected devices such as an AI or a screenless experience through an Alexa device or Google Home, in which users connect and access your service. But a critical part about building trust in this omni-channel world is ensuring that you have a secure authentication experience as users transition between the different channels in which they might access your service. So it is very important to understand that identity and authentication become critical elements in this journey. It's not just from the aspect about who is this user, but it's also critical as part of the security journey that we have the right sort of mechanisms and controls as users authenticate across different channels. And as I say, numbers don't lie. And what we have seen is that over time, the number of users accessing these omni-channel experiences has exponentially grown, right? It's predicted that in the future, about 90% of users will have gone through an omni-channel experience before they buy something in a retail store, for example. So it's predicted that this number should reach about $1 trillion in revenue pretty soon. Now that's pretty rosy numbers if you have not paid attention for. But what's interesting is that the numbers associated with fraud also tend to follow this as users migrate towards omni-channel experiences. It's predicted that fraud in this channel is expected to grow exponentially, and the cost to solve some of the fraud and security problems is actually about $3 for every dollar of fraud that you see. So you're spending nearly at least three times more money as you try to stop fraudsters from attacking you across all these different omni-channel experiences. But when we dig one level deeper behind the numbers, what we see is that trust, which is the key element that users expect in an omni-channel world, is frequently abused by compromising user identity. And this happens in three different ways. The first way is essentially by leveraging stolen identity, where good users' data is taken through data breaches such as the Equifax breach, Target, Home Depot. We don't need to look far to find all of these big breaches that happen. By taking the PII information that's exposed in some of these breaches, attackers take that information and concatenate and construct synthetic identities on your platform. That's the first type. Second, we have the problem of account takeover, where the good users that you spend all the time and effort bringing onto your platform, their credentials are compromised through a third-party data breach potentially, and that information is accessed and used by attackers to get access to a user's account. And finally, especially in an omni-channel world, what we see is that stolen user data is another quick reason or key reason why users come onto your platform to get access. So in many cases, we have seen businesses, while they think about the main doors through the web and they set up all these additional APIs, they find that unsecured APIs are an equally open door for attackers to come in and get access to user data that's stored in that account. So if you're a business leader, if you are a product manager, or if you're a developer sitting in this room, how do you think about securing securing omni-channel and securing trust in this world? We think it's more than just conveying a few icons that represent trust and safety. It's not just the icons on the checkout page or a trust and safety page, but it's understanding, first of all, it starts off by understanding what are the key requirements behind this. When I see customers talk about securing their omni-channel experience, what I realize is that it comes down to three key requirements. First is the security requirement, ensuring that you have the right controls that are appropriate for the different channels a business might offer, and ensuring that the authentication experience is secure. The second part of this journey is ensuring that you have a consistent view of the user independent of the channel they came in. If you think about it, that's the marketing play. And the third piece of this is the user story, which is that you need to enable your users independent of the channel that they come in. So these, we think, are the three fundamental recurring themes that customers ask. So how do you go about securing trust in an omni-channel world? I think the first element in this building block is having identity proofing. So just for some definitions, identity proofing is the bridge that connects users' offline identity, your driver's license, your passport, your college ID, your military service ID, to your online digital identity. And having some sort of a proofing mechanism as users come onto your platform is critical in stopping fake users from registering to your platform. And this is where an identity platform with extensibility built in can help you deliver on that journey. And it's also very important to understand identity proofing is not like a single solution. Every business has different requirements for identity proofing. If you're a financial application, identity proofing might look like someone like Experian, a point-in-time check with someone like Experian. It could also mean, if you're a retailer, it could mean something like a device fingerprinting check to verify the reputation of that device. Or it could be something like checking the reputation of the email that was used to register the user onto your platform. It's very important to understand that when it comes to something like identity proofing, independent of the channel, you need to factor both the channel in which users are coming on your platform and the solutions that are appropriate for that channel. So the other one piece as part of this journey to consider is that when it comes to identity proofing, it's not a point event. It's not like filing a credit application. I come in, fill out a big form of 20 different forms and hit submit. It could also be done in a progressive manner. We saw some of these at the demo today in the morning, but you could also progressively gather user information and use that information and check reputation checks. For example, I come in, I register with the email, create an account. Now you could check with the email reputation service to check the validity of the reputation of that email. Subsequently, when the person comes in and decides to file a loan application or for a credit card, you could take that information and then do a full hard identity check as part of bringing them onto your platform. Now, the key thing to remember is that when you think about an omni-channel world, having the right sort of ID proofing is very relevant, and it requires a lot of strategic thinking. So with that, hopefully with the right solution in place, layered on top of an identity platform, you have the first fundamental building block in stopping fake users. The next piece of this journey is what we call as the privacy journey. It's very important to understand that users trust their data in your service is secure from compromise. We know that in today's world, when you combine our users' online activities, whether the sites we visit, the items we added in the cart, the items we removed from a shopping cart, for example, the places we think about visiting and searching on a search bar, for example, and you combine that with offline activities such as the locations we went to, it provides and is a very powerful tool for like companies and governments to understand what the user is up to. Ensuring that you're transparent about the user's data collected, and you're ensuring that you're ensuring the right sort of controls when you want to access that information is critical in ensuring that you build privacy. So as you think about the privacy challenge in an omni-channel world, think about not only the data that you're gathering, but also the consent and the permissions that you're asking for the user when you gather that information. The third element that's a very critical building block in this journey is what we call as account security. Now, in an omni-channel world, account security is a very complex discussion, because when you think about what's the cost of not having good account security, the result is account takeover. And attackers are getting more sophisticated. Not only are they leveraging credentials that are available in a credential breach, but they're also leveraging your other doors that are not as secure sometimes. So think about your password reset flow. Think about your account recovery flow. Or they're getting even more sophisticated. They're leveraging your call center to actually socially engineer your call center and take over your account. So the story is that the bottom line is that attackers are getting more sophisticated, and they're looking for the weakest link in which they can get access to your account. So when you think about securing your channel and your account thereby, it's important to think about what's available. So through, let's say, for example, if it's a web property, usernames and passwords are very relevant. But if you think about something like a mobile device where you have the luxury of biometric authentication and modern standards such as WebAuthn, leveraging those standards as users authenticate into your platform is very critical in stopping account takeover from happening. The fourth element in this journey is essentially stopping fraud. As I mentioned earlier, fraud can happen from multiple different channels, and attackers are looking for the most insecure channel that you might have. It could be like a connected device, or it could be like a mobile phone, but also your web experience as well. So users, when they come onto your platform, and good users create an account, they trust that all the information stored in that account post-authentication continues to be safe and secure. So having the mechanisms to stop fraud is very critical in this journey. And how do you go about stopping fraud? I think there are a number of different promising approaches to stopping fraud, but solutions such as MFA that are very useful in this front can help stop some of the fraud that you might see at time of payment, for example. But also additional solutions such as continuous authentication, ensuring that the biometric data that you can capture behind the scenes, or the silent attributes that you can capture behind the scenes, still validate that this is the real user, is critical in ensuring stopping fraud. So clearly, using these four elements, you have some of the key building blocks to stopping fraud. And don't get me wrong, the omni-channel experience offers unprecedented opportunity for your business. It is new ways to engage and interact with your customers, but it also offers unprecedented risk. It's a way in which attackers will look for the weakest door to get into your service. And by thinking about those four key pillars, you probably have a good chance to stopping these attackers. Now that's enough of me talking and synthesizing and giving you a lot of insight about what I've seen with customers. Let's shift gears here, take it to a different level, and see how someone took this on in the real world and solved some of those challenges. So Shay from Rent-A-Center is going to talk to us about his journey in securing his omni-channel experience. Thank you, Shay.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I'd like to thank Okta for having me. I'm the Application Development Manager at Rent-A-Center. So those that don't know, we're both a retailer and financial. So we kind of bridge both pillars, as Swaroop was talking about it. People put items on rent, then our revenue is collecting the rent going forward. So payments are very critical to our business. I have both Rent-A-Center.com and the Rent-A-Center mobile app. So when I first started at Rent-A-Center, I was tasked with delivering a mobile app to the enterprise. So one of the first questions I asked myself is, should we use SAML versus OAuth? The current Rent-A-Center.com is using SAML, which has got a long history that isn't part of this presentation. But I took this as a fresh approach to relook at that conversation. So I wanted to give you some of the thoughts and questions I went through as I asked myself that question. If you're using enterprise, then any kind of single sign-on, then SAML is your tool of choice. If you're providing access to any resources, then I would lean towards OAuth. If you're doing any kind of integrated access, like through a portal or that kind of stuff, then I would go back towards SAML. But if you're using any mobile application, I would highly recommend you lean towards OAuth. And just a little slide to show you kind of how I broke it down. If one user in the transaction is an enterprise, then use SAML. For anything external or mobile, I would lean towards OAuth. And to kind of continue what Swaroop was talking about, balancing the security and the ease of use. It's always a balance in software development. There's very few clear-cut answers. It's always a balance. So we wanted to have high security because we collect payments, a lot of payments, and because it's over the life of the rental agreement. So we have to have a good user experience in this, because we need to keep our customers coming back. It's just not a sale for us. We're in the relationship business. So we wanted to have single users between the website and our mobile application, so we use the same Okta tenant. And in OAuth and OIDC Connect, which I'll go into shortly, is the output of the authentication is a concept called a JSON Web Token. This is how long the user is logged in for, and so to balance the security, this should be set for a very short time, because that is used for access to our backend resources, which I'll show. In order to balance that there's a concept called a refresh token, which allows you to continuously extend the life of your JWT. That way you can keep your user logged on for long periods of time, even though they're not. Then another approach I took in OAuth, you typically have a client secret for your application. In a mobile application, please do not do this, because your application can be easily decompiled and that will leak, and that's something you don't want out in the wild. Bad actors can use that. So what you can do is you can use a concept called the proof key of code exchange, and I'm going to show you where that is. You effectively generate some random characters, you hash them, you send them in, and then you send a verifier later in the flow, which I'll show in a little bit. Then the next concept that comes up is OAuth is primarily an authorization mechanism. It doesn't define the authentication. It leaves each provider to do that. OpenID Connect bridges some of the authentication kind of holes in OAuth, and it also allows you to use that PKCE that I talked about, the proof key of code exchange. And how it works is there's two different channels. It's the front channel and the back channel, and there's reasons for that, and I'll show them to you now. The front channel takes place in a web browser, whether it's a web view if you're using a mobile app, or the mobile browser. It's your choice. We lean to use the mobile web view. That way you're not kicking them out and having them go back to your mobile app. If you're using social login, which is another thing that OpenID excels at, it gives the user trust to see your Facebook, your Google login. So when they log in, they enter their user credentials, it is in the browser. The back channel takes place internally. You're making web service calls, and if you're familiar with it, these are done asynchronously, so keep that in mind in your button states. Put an activity indicator. don't assume it's done and then have the user trying to interact with it before it's done, because there's a few different conversations that are taking place between your application and the identity provider. Just a template. So let me show you the flow that takes in. This is the code flow or the authorization flow in the mobile application. So when you launch the application, you may bring up your login page, or if you're using a refresh token, you may check that. If it's not there, then you bring that up. But you launch either a mobile, the embedded web browser, or you kick them out to the mobile browser. They enter their username and password. When you authenticate with your identity provider, which is Okta for us, then you get a token is returned. This is happening in the front channel. Then your second step is, this is also in the front channel, is you take that token and you exchange it for an auth code. If this step is you're sending in that hash random character strings for the PKCE, or they're called PIXE if you read online. People like to abbreviate, it makes stuff easier to pronounce. So that is done in the front channel as well. Then this is where you pick up from the back channel, is you take your token, your auth code, and you exchange it for your JSON web token, your JWT. Then once that is handed back to you, validate it, make sure it's against the issuer that you're expecting. You do not want a man in the middle intercepting that and giving you a fake token. And then I'll show you the structure of it. Then we take that JWT, and then we're using an enterprise service bus for our endpoint. And there's no service account in the mobile application, because this is another leak point. For a lot of people just have a service account with basic authentication. We take that JWT and we pass it to our ESB, and the ESB authenticates it and authorizes it based on the JWT that's passed in. They can parse it internally and validate it, and or they can delegate it back to the IDP and verify it that way. That's the more secure approach. Some people split in the middle, where you check half of them internally and delegate half of them back out. That way you've got 50% chance of catching one if it's been revoked for whatever reason. And then in another concept of the OpenID Connect gives you is a concept called custom claims. These are extended attributes of the user's identity. We used it for different data points in that it's returned in the JWT. You can use account numbers, telephone numbers. If you're trying to roll your own multi-factor, please don't. But you can have as many of these as you want. Just think of them as extended attributes to your profile. That's kept track on your identity provider. Then if you're wondering what the JWT looks like, this is one that I generated. It looks like a bunch of random alphanumeric characters, but there's a structure to it. Once you parse it, which is easy to do, there's libraries to do it, or the structure's not hard to do. This is what it looks like it's parsed. It gives you the issuer, the expiry time, which is a key point that I wanted to call out. That is a hard expiry time. When it's issued for ever how long it's defined. It's not like a web session that keeps getting extended each time you touch it. So if it expires in 5 minutes, it expires in 5 minutes. It won't be extended. So if you're using a mobile application, I would highly recommend you set a timer and manage that way. So as you approach the expiry time, you can trigger the exchange with the refresh token and get a new fresh JWT, and your user's still in business. Then you can manage it if it's the timer, if they go to the background or they bring it to the foreground. Then when you store these, make sure if you are using the refresh token, please put them in secure storage, keychain for iOS or the key store in Android, because that can be used to generate a new JWT. Then if you have any custom claims, they'll be returned in this. As you can see, this SCP is the offline access. That's the refresh token. And you have the canonical user ID from your identity provider, which is the UID. Those are defined by the spec. And there's some other stuff that's defined as a spec as well. So I wanted to share some resources that I used when I was going down this journey. OAuth 2 in Action is a really good book. I highly recommend you look at it, as well as Okta's developer resources. That run kit is a very nice thing to do to generate your Pixie codes when you're working through your development, because they're a little obtuse. Anyway, I'll turn it back over to Swaroop.
Hey, thank you so much, Shay. So hopefully all of you guys got a sense of appreciation and complexity involved while trying to secure your omni-channel experience. Remember that this is not a point solution, this is really a journey, and you need to think about this journey in terms of all the different elements. That was the complexity Shay went through when he tried to build out security from an authentication standpoint. But additionally, you need to think about the identity creation process, as I mentioned earlier. You need to think about privacy, but you also need to think about fraud. And when you combine all these four elements together and you layer below thoughts about the user experience, you really have a solution for building for trust without compromising security in the process. So with that, I want to open up the floor for more Q&A, but I also want to remind you guys that we have a mobile app. If you don't have it, I highly recommend to download the app and rate this session. Your feedback matters a lot for us. Additionally, I want to call out for some awesome sessions that we have planned. I know I gave you a lot of high-level elements that how to think about security and trust and privacy, a lot of interesting concepts. But these three sessions are highly recommended from my end. John and Wills are going to talk about the customer identity roadmap. Not only are they going to talk about some of the elements they built and accomplished in the last few months, but they're going to talk about some of the other things that they're thinking about in the year to come. Nate, who's our product manager for the developer experience, is going to talk to you about some of the SDKs and some of the developer experience kits that he's building out. So when you think about SDKs for push, think about all of those things will be there. And finally, Tanaha and Alex Bovey are going to talk about our security roadmap. So when you think about account security, building better security, a lot of the topics that they're thinking about and trying to solve in the year to come are going to be covered in that session. I highly recommend attending these three sessions, but also in the process, I want to open up the floor and take any questions you guys might have.
The authorization service is Okta. We're using the OAuth Flow. So all the IDP slides, if you can go back to my bill.
Yeah. This one.
Yeah. These are all hitting. IDP is Okta. It's just the identity provider. And once we have the JWT, then we're passing it to our ESB, who is validating it and making a call back to Okta as well to validate it.
I think if you have additional questions, we have a blog post on how to think about authentication authorization. It's frequently conflated, so there's a simple blog post on the Okta page. Highly recommend looking about that to get more detailed info.
Yeah, and I have a prototype app if I can share as well. So.
Right.
Yeah.
So thank you for the detailed explanation here. What I'm trying to say is that between SAML and OAuth, what is the preferred approach? And I know it depends on the use cases.
It depends on the use case. I selected, for the mobile application, we were using OAuth. For rentacenter.com, it was done before I got there. They selected SAML because they were most familiar with it. If the choice was mine, I would have used an OAuth, an implicit flow probably for OAuth Flow for that.
Is the industry moving from SAML to OAuth?
I have a backlog of, yes, it's on the backlog.
Okay.
My backlog's very long though, so.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question at the back.
Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions in the back. So go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My question was about the balancing security and ease of use. We're also starting the Okta journey, and we have both internal requirements for the internal apps, and we're going to be using Okta also for client. And my question was the criteria used to go with one instance or tenant versus having one for client, one for internal.
So if I understood your question correctly, like your question was around what trade-offs do you make between customer identity, like user experience, and workforce identity. Did I get your question correct?
Same Okta instance.
Yeah. So I can cover some of that, but maybe Shay, you want to open up and say how?
Either. We, at Rent-A-Center, we have 3 tenants. We have an internal for our employees. It's integrated with Active Directory. So they log in, they hit our tenant.okta.com, and they log in and they can access a cajillion apps that are all integrated with Okta. Then for our external facing, we have another tenant that's used for the mobile application, and rentacenter.com, they're a shared tenant. So the users, you registered in one, you can log in with the other, vice versa. It's seamless. Then we have another business unit, and so we have a separation. So you have to, if you're a customer in both, you would log in, you have 2 logins. They won't, we had a legal and operation requirement to keep them separate. So that was for the 3rd tenant. So I would recommend, just me personally, I would recommend you have a tenant for internal and a tenant for external.
So I think to add to that, I have customers who have a huge number of tenants depending on the business complexity. So especially if your business spans different regions, has different legislative requirements, that's pretty common to see breaking it down based on different tenants. That's one common scenario that I see. But also you had a question about the user experience versus convenience between workforce and customer, right? So when it comes to workforce, let's be honest, you don't have much of a choice. You work there, right? You got to follow what the IT team says. So if it's 2FA everywhere, 2FA at an app, you basically make the choice. But you should remember that behind the scenes, Okta gives you the controls for you to decide if it's necessary or not. So if an employee is trying to log into their work app using the corporate issued laptop inside of your corporate network, there's very little need for MFA. But if you deem it necessary based on your business needs and the org, for example, that the person works in, so someone in engineering who's trying to get access to a code base might be more high, then you might want to have additional security, for example. That's typically how it is done. On the consumer side, this conversation is actually way more nuanced than what we can actually have in this session. But basically, if you think about it, secondary factor, 2-factor is not the most ideal situation, or you want to be very judicious of how you deploy it. The question for you is, how do you be so judicious, right? And that's where something like an adaptive or a behavioral authentication can come and really shine and reduce the number of instances you're prompting your customers for MFA. So things like, hey, if the user is logging in from this known location, their known MacBook, you don't need MFA. But when something is off, or they're coming in from a risky IP address, right, that you have previously someone on the Okta network has seen as being malicious, that's a good reason why you should probably prompt for MFA. The one exception to that story and that question that you have is we obviously know banking applications, for example, there's compliance reasons, insurance apps for insurance also has certain compliance requirements, healthcare similarly. For those you have customers willing to put up and have MFA in the experience. So it's a bunch of trade-offs between convenience and user experience, but by leveraging things like behavioral authentication, you have the ability to kind of reduce the number of times you're prompting your users for MFA. And that can be a very powerful driver for better experience. In fact, I know of one VP of product who said that she was trying to be secure, and she was trying to actually improve the Net Promoter Score of her product area. And she was using adaptive MFA to reduce the number of times she was prompting users. So it's a pretty complicated topic. I can probably take 40 minutes going over about it, but there's a lot of detail there that are highly, and also a lot of exciting areas. There are new protocols and technologies like WebAuthn that can really revolutionize how we authenticate into web applications that can really help improve the experience. So that's a lot of talking from me. Yeah. So I'm sorry I'm being blinded by the light, but go ahead.
Okay, hi. Thank you for the great talk. I am Krishna. And in my organization, we are also embarking on revamping our consumer IAM space. I had one question on the authorization piece. I understand we have multiple options for authentication like 2FA and MFA like you mentioned. When you have scenarios where you have your external consumers authorize multiple apps internally, whether it's workforce or consumers, have you guys used any custom authorization frameworks, or does Okta have any frameworks which I could leverage to authorize access for my consumers?
So you're basically asking about how do we build out an authorization policy framework for different user groups, right?
Correct.
Yes, we do, but I am not the subject matter expert on that, so I'll be giving you wrong advice. But we can connect offline, and I'll put you in touch with the person who can give you the best practices there.
Okay.
Or stop by at the Okta booth downstairs, and we should have a subject matter expert there who can guide you through.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the great talk. So my question is, within the enterprise, if I have a lot of applications that need to be secured with a seamless identity management, do you see a need of using OAuth for that purpose with Open Connect, or can I simply go with simple password-based authentication and then grant an access to all the applications seamlessly?
So I'll give you the point answer. Standards. That's the best approach to go. As in, there are a number of security reasons that I don't need to go in. That'll take us a lot of time. But standards. First of all, it's a lot of different applications that you might need to connect support. So you're not, using something that's proprietary. But also additionally, when you think about the security risks, your security team will probably do an audit and say no, don't do that. So without going into the details there, my personal recommendation is always go with something like OpenID Connect and OAuth to drive your authentication experience. Standards always. Yes. Go ahead. Oh, 1 second, let the microphone.
You mentioned about MFA.
Yeah.
Is it pre-configured, or also you mentioned if you are logging into other computer or some other device, you can change the MFA, isn't it? How is it possible?
So one follow-up question is this for a workforce use case, or is this for a customer use case?
Customer use.
So when it comes to MFA, when it comes to MFA, Okta's MFA solution is essentially a platform approach. So we give you a range of MFA options as an admin that you can pick that's most relevant for you. So what our recommendation is that there might be scenarios for customers where security question or a knowledge-based question is appropriate and enough. The risk involved is very minimal. So go with that. But if you're a banking application, you're a financial application where the stakes are way higher, there are higher assurance factors that are in play that Okta offers that you can just turn on, including biometric authentication. Now, the other piece in this decision is also understanding user risk groups. So good practitioners break their users into high-risk groups. For example, Beyonce is on your platform. What do? She's going to be attacked every day, right? Your Instagram, for example. So you want to probably put these high-risk individuals in a higher security group and force them, hey, anytime you log in, go through MFA, right? So it involves you looking at your security risk profile and then putting them in appropriate groups. And we give you all the policies to drive both enrollment of the second factor, but also the enforcement. Where do you want to enforce? Do you want to enforce it at the app level once, or do you want to enforce it multiple times when they log in? Do you want to based on time? There are a number of different options that the policy engine can give you. This might be an appropriate approach based on that risk group for you to factor. Any other questions? Cool, going once, twice, and try. Oh, there is a question in the back.
I don't have a question per se. It's more of a small announcement. So I'm a product manager at Okta, and I'm working on an area about growing SIAM user bases by 20 to 40% using external identity providers, which seems like a relevant area for this room here. So if anyone wants to talk about that or learn a little bit more about some of that stuff, I'll be hanging out in the back, and please come up to me, and I'd love to talk to you guys. Sorry about hijacking that, Swaroop.
No, all good. Is there any more questions? Yeah.
Just one quick question. You mentioned privacy obviously is an important part of the journey for consumer identity.
Yep.
Are there any tools or integrations that Okta's done, for example, with like a OneTrust privacy platform or other to create that fully integrated privacy consent journey?
So a couple of things. Okta has some privacy management tools in the product itself. If you stop by at our booth, we can show you some of the tools and capabilities that we have that we can show you. Additionally, we are very open-minded about partnering, and we're actively looking for partners in this segment, and we have partners too. So if you come down to our booth, I can talk to you in more detail about some of the interesting concepts we're working on this front. We've done a lot of progress here in-house, but also we understand it's a fairly privacy is a very complicated concept. There's a lot of different use cases and scenarios. I'm coming in from Russia, privacy looks different. Privacy and consent looks different. I'm coming in from China, it looks different. I'm coming in from the US. Worse still, I think it might even look worse once we have CCNA and all these local, regional privacy laws that come into play. So we have a solution in place, or we have an approach in place that I can talk to you about, and hopefully that'll meet your needs. Cool. Yes.
A question for Shay. When you use the back office or call center to manage identities, maybe force a password reset or make those kinds of changes, do you use the Okta GUI, or did you code your own kind of call center app using API calls?
We have a custom login page and a custom password reset page for a few different use cases, which I really don't want to go into, but it's custom, and then they're using the Okta APIs to do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, there's another question over here.
In the white. Yeah, in the white.
Gentleman in the white?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, last question. So
if I have a use case like Google, where you have a centralized authentication, but you provide a seamless experience to different Google applications like Gmail, YouTube, whatever the Google has access to. Does Okta has anything kind of a package that we can leverage to implement?
So you're basically asking about Google as an IDP provider, right?
Yes. Social login.
So the gentleman there is go give him a hug. He'll give you all the details. We have over 30 different integrations for these different IDP providers. It might be Google in the US, it might be a different vendor in China, but as long as it talks standards, we have a lot of them, and Arish has worked a lot on that front. So have a chat with him, he'll tell you a lot of interesting and exciting stuff there. Cool, so I think we're at the end of time. I can see the buzzer going off here. So thank you so much for attending our session, and giving a lot of discussion and interesting talking points here. So thank you.
Thank you very much.